Welcome to this module on energy and energy requirements. Energy in the sense of energy in food is sometimes listed under macronutrients. But energy is of course not a nutrient, it's something our bodies can derive from the macronutrients fat, carbohydrates and protein. And something we can also derive from alcohol, although I wouldn't call that a nutrient. To understand anything about energy in food, we need to take two common units of measurement. The calorie, which is the energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water through 1 degree Celsius, or by 1 degree Celsius. A kilocalorie is simply the energy needed to raise the temperature of 1,000 grams, or 1 litre of water, by 1 degree Celsius. The other term, and the one used more in New Zealand, at least in professional circles, is kilojoules. A joule is defined as equal to the energy transferred to, or work done on, an object when a force of 1 Newton acts on that object in the direction of its motion through a distance of 1 metre. If you're thinking, huh? I can only say that the definition doesn't do much for me either. The bottom line is that both the joule and the calorie, or for us, the kilojoule and the kilocalorie, are measures of energy in food. And if you ever need to convert between the two, well, 1 calorie equals 4.814 joules. That also means that 1 kilocalorie equals 4.814 kilojoules. So there's what you need to either multiply by or divide by to convert one into the other. So how do we determine the energy in food itself? Well, we use one of these, a bomb calorimeter. This works by looking at how much heat a sample of food gives off when literally burned. When we do this, we get the following numbers, also known as Atwater general factors or averages, named after the person who did this work. 1 gram of carbohydrate is equivalent to, very close to, 4 kilocalories or 17 kilojoules. 1 gram of protein is the same. It's equivalent to something around 4 kilocalories or 17 kilojoules. Fat, on the other hand, or 1 gram of fat or oil, is equivalent to 9 kilocalories or 37 kilojoules, so a little bit more than twice as energy dense as protein or carbohydrate. I did mention alcohol before, and here it is. 1 gram of alcohol is equivalent to about 7 kilocalories or 29 kilojoules, so actually between protein or carbohydrate and fat in terms of calories. 1 gram of dietary fiber is equivalent to about 2 kilocalories or 8 kilojoules. The last one is actually not data from a bomb calorimeter. You see, we can't convert dietary fiber to energy, but the bacteria, mainly in our colon, our large intestine, can. They in turn produce short-chain fatty acids, so it's a type of fat, which our human cells can use as energy. And the 2 kilocalories or 8 kilojoules per gram is an estimate. It's here just so that you realize that dietary fiber can have a direct effect on our energy intake, even if only a modest one. Now, those numbers were averages. This is what we actually get when we measure different foods. Compare what we get from protein in egg versus protein in brown rice, for example, or fat from eggs versus fat from dairy or meat. This is just here as a reminder that we're so often working with averages and generalizations in nutrition and nutrition recommendations. It's best not to get too fixated on a very specific number, as that number is likely just to be an average or a generalization or a ballpark figure anyway. People can get way too concerned about their calories. Now, if their calories are consistently high, they will gain weight. It's as simple as that. So that means they need to reduce it. On the other hand, if they're desperately trying to gain weight and it's not happening, calories have to go up, or energy has to go up. Never mind what is written on paper and what various formulas will work out. Okay, even more important, our bodies are not bomb calorimeters. Much as we talk about burning calories, there are no little fires going on in our cells, which is just as well. The main product of using food for fuel is ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, which our cells can then use to do work, from muscle contraction to the conduction of a signal along a nerve. Heat is, for us, usually a fortunate byproduct of generating ATP. It would actually make more sense to talk about ATP as the unit of energy in food, but this would get very complex, and units like kilocalories and kilojoules are okay in terms of providing some useful information as long as people don't get obsessed by very specific numbers. Another thing to be aware of is that just because we swallow a piece of food or drink does not mean all the potential energy in that food is available to us. We have Ingested energy. That is what the food labels and diet recording apps tell us, what went in. But we lose some of what went in via energy in feces, and also combustible gas from microbial fermentation. That's because our digestion isn't perfect, so some food makes it all the way through without being broken down. And because the bacteria that call our bowels home also take some of the food and turn it into gases. This applies more to some foods than others, and you'll probably be aware of which foods it applies to for you. We then get to digestible energy. But again, we can lose some energy, this time in urine. Now in healthy people, this is pretty minor. But in people with very high blood glucose, the kidney's ability to reabsorb glucose is exceeded, so some glucose ends up in the urine. This is even where diabetes gets its name from, specifically the now often dropped part, mellitus. It used to be called diabetes mellitus, which is ancient Greek for honey and comes from the fact that in people with poorly controlled diabetes, the urine has a sweet smell and also a sweet taste. Another way we lose rather than use energy is so-called surface energy. This includes things such as skin that flakes off, hair that we lose, losses of any macronutrients in sweat. And that finally gives us metabolizable energy, the actual energy available for our body to use, to live, to do work. So the key message here is that human beings don't work like bomb calorimeters. People vary in their ability to extract energy from food. There have been some great talks on where food goes, or where macronutrients go when we convert them to energy, by Dr. Ruben Meerman, shown here. One is part of this week's viewing, so make sure you watch that. It really is a great talk that covers a lot of nutrition in a very short time. In terms of measuring energy use, or to use the correct terminology, energy expenditure, the best way is to measure oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide excretion. Now we can do this with a mask or by using an airtight chamber or room. When we do this, we can get a sense of energy requirements. So how is energy used? Well, in general, irrespective of how much energy we need, the majority of it will be used to sustain all the processes that keep us alive, like breathing, heartbeat, generating sufficient body heat, and the numerous activities that keep cells alive. We call this the basal metabolic rate. Another portion, on average, a little less than a third, is used for voluntary physical activity, and the technical term is activity thermogenesis. Then about 10% is the thermic effect of food. This is the energy cost of processing and storing food. Now 10% is a rough figure. As a rule, lipids take less energy to process in contrast to, say, proteins. Now, before you equate the activity thermogenesis with energy cost of exercise, remember that exercise is only a subset of physical activity, and not everyone does things that fit the definition of exercise. Even sedentary activities, though, like sitting at an office desk, require some energy. It takes some energy to maintain posture, to write or type, to talk and occasionally get up and move around. It's just that much of the energy is non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT. This can still add up over several hours. Alternatively, someone might spend quite a bit of their time exercising, in which case non-exercise activity thermogenesis may make up a smaller portion and exercise thermogenesis makes up a larger portion. You might be thinking, but what if someone does a lot of physical activity, such as hours of training each day or a very physical job? Won't activity thermogenesis just go very high and soon overtake basal metabolism? That would be consistent with the so-called additive model of total energy expenditure. TEE is total energy expenditure, shown on the top here. Now this model assumes that the more exercise or more physical activity we do, the higher our energy requirements. But that often isn't what we observe. The constrained model of total energy expenditure suggests that there is a ceiling and that non-physical activity, so think basal metabolic rate, goes down as physical activity goes up. There is some good evidence for this. Basically, over time, we get more energy efficient. Now, neither model fits reality perfectly and people vary, but the second, the constrained model, arose out of the observation that modern hunter-gatherers did not necessarily expend a lot more energy in total than people living in a more modern way, or semi-sedentary lifestyle, despite the hunter-gatherers being much more physically active. So again, the hunter-gatherers didn't really need a lot more energy than modern, more sedentary folk, despite being much more physically active. Just to help visualize these two models, in the additive model, as the energy cost of physical activity increases, the total energy expenditure increases by the same amount, completely additive. Whereas in the constrained model, as the energy cost of physical activity increases, the basal metabolic rate decreases to partially compensate. Interestingly, we see the same thing when people restrict their energy for weight reduction. Their metabolism gets more efficient, and their basal metabolism goes down. And they do not get the degree of weight reduction that will be expected from a simple energy deficit calculation, where we go, okay, 1 gram of fat equals 9 calories. They do, of course, get some reduction, but they don't get everything we would expect if we just did the simple math. Getting back to the earlier observation that basal metabolism makes up the majority of energy requirements. This, of course, isn't always true. There's always an exception to the rule. Here you can see professional strongman Eddie Hall pulling a 500 kilogram deadlift, world record breaking at the time. Now, around this time, he had a measured basal metabolic rate of 4,900 kilocalories a day, but ate 9 to 12,000 kilocalories a day in his diet at a body weight of around 190 kilograms. So on his higher calorie days, his basal metabolic rate made up less than 45% of his energy requirements. Now, this would also be true for someone recovering from severe burns, for example, but these are extreme situations. For most of us, even if we're very active, basal metabolism makes up the bulk of our energy requirement. The key message here is that our bodies want to conserve energy, so increased physical activity, for example as exercise, is compensated for by decreased energy consumption elsewhere, but only to a point. How do we explain some of these findings? Well, here are estimated resting energy requirement by some key organs. Just like for muscles, if an organ does more, it needs more energy. Now, the adipose tissue, at least white adipose tissue, has limited scope for changing its activity, but every other organ has a much broader range. Note that the heart and the kidneys are joint first as big power users, with the brain and liver coming in second and third, and muscle comes in a distant fourth, at least when at rest. So although it's technically true that more muscle mass means more energy used even at rest, the amount is very modest. Gain an extra kilogram of muscle and expend an extra 13 kilocalories a day. Not exactly a great deal. Even if you gain an extra 10 kilograms of muscle, which is quite an impressive amount, you'd be looking at 130 kilocalories a day. On the other hand, make that muscle work hard, and then having more muscle means being able to use more energy in a given amount of time. Because working muscle takes a lot more. This is just the amount of energy required by muscle to maintain itself, to basically not waste away when it's not being used. The key messages are: adipose tissue requires very little energy. Muscle at rest requires little energy to maintain. And internal organs actually require the most energy even when we're at rest.